and sample. And China is saying, well, let's go and sample in Thailand and East Asia and so on. But if you look at it, actually, where are, again, the closest virus to SARS-CoV-2? Well, they're all from that mine. So before we go in Thailand, why don't we go back to the mine? I mean, the first thing you would expect
to the mine where many coronavirus samples were collected from, and where
all the
there is a documented outbreak.
Where all the closest one are. I mean, if someone gets killed at the corner of your street, you're not going to go, to another city to actually look for, clues. You go back to the corner of the street. I mean, that's fairly logical, yeah? So,
here's something else in your letter, which is very striking. Something else in your letter, which is very striking, says that staff at the Wuhan labs were all tested negative for COVID-19, for SARS-CoV-2 antibodies. Statistically, you say that this is unlikely, given that there were more than 590 staff and students at the lab, and about 4.4% of the Wuhan urban population test positive around that time. This is during the outbreak of COVID. Even if only 85 people were tested, the chance of no positive test would still be less than 4%. How can the contradiction be explained? So you're saying you believe what? That people indeed had tested positive in the lab and the Chinese don't want to say it?
Well, let me tell you, because the Chinese have been very careful not to say exactly anything precise so that you can't actually pin them. So they never said how many people were actually tested. It's very vague. So the best you'll find is in some declaration, they say students and staff at the WIFE have been tested. They all came back negative. In some of the declarations, they say students and staff in Xizhengli unit were tested. And in another declaration, they say students and staff in 4 labs they went to or visited or talked to were tested, and they all came back negative. So basically, it's very difficult to actually understand what they're saying. The fact is, if you want to actually look at the possibilities that someone got infected in that lab, and given that it's an airborne, virus, very easily, I mean, if for example, one of the filters in the lab was out of service, anybody downwind from that lab could get infected. So really what you need to do is to actually sample everybody, not just the team where Xizhengli was, but everybody in the lab, the students, even the temporary workers, because we know that some temporary workers were only 15 meters downwind from the lab, 15 meters downwind from the lab. There are barracks down there for temporary workers. So everybody down there really should be tested, okay? Now, if you take it to the maximum, which is about 590, the chance of negative, given the prevailing effectively occurrence of COVID-19 at the time, which was 4.4% according to Chinese papers. The probability of nobody testing positive is about 1 in 1/10 of a billion. Okay, it's mathematical.
1/10 of a billion.
Yes.
Wow.
That's mathematical. It's what's called a binomial, basically, distribution. I won't go into the details, but if you crunch the numbers, it's about 1/10 of a billion. No, and you can look at it, okay, so maybe they were a bit lazy, they didn't do the right job, they just tested, 20 is there, maybe a few more, and maybe, so I say maybe 80 people, effectively, that's a bit lazy, that's not good enough, they should do a better job. But even if they tested 80 people, the chances of nobody testing positive is around 3.5%, less than 4%. Now, not only it's still very small, but in any case, they wouldn't have tested correctly. They should have tested more people. There are many scenarios, by the way. It's not just, it can actually be what's called a lab-acquired infection, meaning someone in a lab, someone directly in a lab doing the experiments. If there was an experiment, it could be someone in an area which is common. I mean, that happened in Beijing. Some people got infected. They were not directly working with SARS at the time, but they were sharing premises with people, working on SARS. So you have to test, quite generally. You have to test even downwind, because, I mean, even if there's, let's say, liquid waste or, problem with drainage, you need to test around. You need to test all the teams that went and actually sampled in these, in Mojiang and elsewhere. So actually, there's quite a few people to sample, to test. Really, that would be the first thing you would be doing normally if you were doing things seriously. You would actually list everybody who's gone to sampling in a wild. You would be listing everybody who's been present in a lab, and you would test everybody.
What do you make of, let me ask you another thing. What do you make of Stephen Quay, a physician researcher? Do you know him?
Yes, I know him. Yeah, sure.
So he has done a study now, statistical study, which shows hospitals receiving the early patients of COVID-19 in China are all clustered along the subway line number 2. And that is relevant because that subway line runs from the Wuhan lab to the airport. What do you make of that?
And close to the market too.
And close to the market.
The river. It crosses the river and across Wuhan.
Okay.
Well, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you remember what happened, let's say with SARS, public transport is usually a huge facilitators of infection. So usually, if you really want to try to understand the dynamics, you look at public transport and you look at places where people, are very tight together like a market, especially Chinese markets, like wet markets in China. I don't know whether you've been to any, but I think it's quite tight. It's quite tight. There's not much sun. It's very humid. There's water everywhere, and there's a lot of people there, and it's not very clean. So these are the places where people will move in and out, and that's typically effectively what could spark a proper infection. So I think it makes a lot of sense effectively that maybe the line number 2 played a role, and it could explain why effectively eventually the virus spread to that market. Now, I think we know since February 2020 that the market most likely is not where it started. It's just a place where it was amplified. There was actually a very interesting paper published on 22nd of February 2020 by actually a Chinese team, which actually just said just that. It just said, actually it's not from the market, cannot be from the market. So actually we know that for more than a year now. I mean, there's nothing new there. I mean, within less than 2 months, people already had concluded it couldn't be from the market, or most likely it wasn't from the market. So yes, line number 2 would certainly have could have played a major role. And it certainly points to the potential of emergence further down south, maybe closer to the WWIV, maybe closer to one of the PLA military hospitals, which is one of the hypotheses that Dr. Quay has been mentioning quite a bit, because he's also found that actually the early specific viruses, the earliest one, were not actually at the market. They seem to be coming back to cases which were treated in that military hospital.
What does that tell us if they had early cases treated at a military hospital?
Well, Dr. Quay actually found some interesting things there, which actually seems to show that the military hospital was actually treating early cases. So that wouldn't, now that again, that's, we're talking about collecting data and trying to make sense of it. The first thing we have is to collect the data. The interpretation is always something that can be discussed, and people may say, well, it's just, coincidence, whatever. But the fact is, there's data that shows effectively that some early cases, very early cases, with certainly the precursor of the actual virus, or the earliest one we know, certainly go back to that military hospital. So that could make sense. I mean, if you believe that effectively there were cases in November, as the US intelligence services have been saying, if you believe that 3 people, for example, at the lab, technicians at the lab fell ill, as was disclosed some time ago, then yes, it could make sense. But that's one interpretation. That's one way of putting things together.
You're talking 1 month before the Chinese officially announced it in December that they had cases in November.
Well, actually, the Chinese never really actually acknowledged that they had cases in November. The Chinese have put a rule, and the rule that they put in place is that there's no case in November. They will never tell you there's a case in November. They will never, for the simple reason that if they did so, then there's stories that it started, in Spain, in France, in the UK, or in Italy, or wherever, and just basically ended up in Wuhan. All that story obviously would be proved very clearly to be complete nonsense.
The Chinese also would say that people like you, um, are just trying to cook up some conspiracy against them, and that they have cooperated with the WHO, and they have been, I guess they might say they've been open and transparent, and that the origins of COVID came from another country, maybe in frozen food. You've been working on this for a year or more.
Yeah, yes.
What do you
Well,
say? I mean,
uh,
what's realistic?
uh, the reality is that I think nobody really believes that they were exactly transparent. I think Dr. Tedros, basically Director General of the WHO, himself said he was very disappointed that there was not the access that is needed to the data. And once again, this is about data. Myself, I'm a data analyst. I believe in data. Give me the data. That's all I ask for. Uh, expert opinion with the data is nothing. When someone writes a letter and tells you, oh, we believe that this has been done in Lancet or somewhere else, that's expert opinion with that data. It's worth nothing. Okay, it's worth nothing. You have to have data. Expert opinion with that data is nothing. Let's go and get the data. That's what DRASTIC has done for a year now. We go and get the data, and we actually show the data. We work from data. And we don't have, what we would like to see is effectively the real data about the cases in November. We know that it exists because the South China Morning Post actually saw it and reported about it. And there were 9 cases which were confirmed in November. The first one on the 17th, but not the only one. There were 4 men, 5 women. There were from, I think, 39 or 36 to 70 something, so quite aged people, which means, and these are the ones who ended in hospital. So realistically, there's about at least 6 to 10 times more people who got infected. So in November, there would have been at least 60 people already infected. And we know that. Everybody knows that. Even Peter Mbarek basically pointed to that reality, is that there must be November cases. The problem is that China basically would rather cut, both its legs rather than say that there are cases in November. But it's a charade. I think everybody knows there must be cases in November.
It's a charade. Okay. Where do you think this ends? I mean, you've called on the Chinese to provide the data. There are many more people who are saying, look, this story doesn't float. There has to be more experimentation from that lab that you need to come clean on. You need to show us what you did in the lab. The Chinese, have put up a wall on all of this, but slowly it seems like the noose is tightening, in the sense that evidence does trickle out and there is a trail to follow.
Yes.
And it just doesn't end here with Chinese denials. I mean, the investigations will continue and the demands for transparency will continue.
Yeah, definitely, and we'll get more data. The reality is that the Chinese are fairly good at removing data, but usually they're a bit behind us. I can tell you, DRASTIC usually find public data and get there and find it, before the Chinese has got a chance to remove it. And you can actually get data, and very interesting one. And I think we can still do a lot on that side. There's still a biological argument where actually researchers are still looking at it from the genome point of view, and trying to basically test a few ideas there. So there's that side of the argument, which is more driven by the biological argument. And there's a data-driven argument, which DRASTIC and others have been working on. And there's, you don't need to be in China to get the data. The reality, the WHO joint team in China certainly did what they could with the data they had, and they certainly made some progress, I would say, on the standard zoonosis pathways. But if you want to investigate the lab-related accident pathway, it's better to do it actually from outside China, honestly. You're not going to be able to do much from China.
Gilles Demaneuf, thank you so much for your time. And I have a funny feeling we'll be talking to you again. And I really do appreciate all of your insight and your perspective on this. And a year and a half into a world pandemic, we should know how the hell it started, and we don't know.